So, my name is Sinead McBrearty, and I'm the Chief Executive of Education Support. I'm guessing you've heard of Education Support because you're attending this webinar. But for anyone who doesn't know anything about us, this is a charity that's been around for 149 years. It was set up by teachers for teachers, and we exist to promote and improve the mental health and well-being of everyone working in education, because we believe that that leads to better outcomes for everybody. And we work in a variety of ways. We have a free helpline available to anyone, a counselling helpline with qualified counsellors available 24/7 to anyone in any education role in any setting across the United Kingdom. We also work directly with schools in a variety of ways. And then we research the health and well-being of the workforce, and we try and advocate for improvement in education based on what the evidence shows. So that's kind of the way that we work. And I'm sure my colleagues will share a variety of resources in the chat at some point when it all goes quiet to share some of that work with you. And we have a fantastic panel joining us today. The nice thing about this job is sometimes you think, well, I'd quite like to take this conversation out to a coffee shop. You know, you can kind of imagine sitting over a latte with these guys and having a bit of chat, and that being quite pleasant. And now I've just reminded myself that I'm coffee free sat here, so I'll just indulge in enjoying their company instead. So we have on this panel the splendid Evelyn Ford, who is magnificent in many ways. Evelyn was a head teacher in North London. She has been, she is very well regarded across the sector, having been an outstanding head teacher. I mean, a head teacher of outstanding practice, as well as having been a president at ASCL, many other accolades coming her way. But she has left headship and is working now with heads and with leadership teams, coaching and mentoring, supporting new heads coming through the system. And Evelyn uses her voice and expertise to really focus on the voices of marginalized groups in education and make sure that we attend to including everybody in our work, in our thinking, in our policy making, in our data, and in all the things, all the good stuff that we do. So I'm delighted to have her here, not least because she's a trustee of Education Support, which only speaks to her great taste in charities, I think. I'm also delighted to welcome Sean Trelawney. Sean is head of faculty at a large secondary school in Brighton. And he is, in his work, leading the strategic development of students' personal, social, moral, and cultural education. I can think of nowhere better than Brighton for such an endeavour, actually. As well as having a lot of experience as a teacher and a middle leader, Sean has done specifically worked as a mental well-being lead and as a head of department. So he has some really important insight to bring to us from what he's learned in those roles, what he understands about class practice, school practice, leadership, middle leadership practice. I think there's a lot of value that we're going to get from the experience that he's going to bring to this conversation. So delighted he can join us. And then our third panelist is the mighty, do I call you doctor now? Dr. Simon Knight? Simon has been awarded an honorary doctorate from Brookes University because he's so amazing on the topic of special educational needs and disabilities that the universities are turning to him as the man with the insight. He's joint head teacher at Frank Wise School, which is a community special school in Oxfordshire. And he is, if you're anywhere in the sector paying attention to commentary and thinking and thoughtfulness, then you can't but have seen Simon's contributions, which are always deeply thoughtful and grounded in real evidence and the best kind of leadership practice, I think. One that is imbued with integrity, Simon, if I may say. So that's who we have here to have this conversation today. Just as a little bit of background, and then I will stop speaking, I promise. Education Support has been working on this theme of retention for quite a long time. Evelyn, who's here as a panelist, chaired our 2023 Commission on Teacher Retention. And we really use that work to try and get and garner some focus in the sector on retention, because I think we all know there's a lot, and rightly so, a lot of attention paid to recruiting teachers into the profession. But in 2023, there was almost nothing being said about retention. And given that we look at well-being and we look at the signs of well-being in the sector, for us, retention seemed like such a critical thing for us to attend to. Because if we cannot keep people in the job, we're never going to attract enough talent. Because you kind of, you know yourself, if you're walking in the front door of a restaurant and you're watching everybody else walking out the back door, you're going to ask yourself a few questions. Um, we have also produced at the back end of 2025 a policy paper on retention, where we tried to get sector stakeholders to engage in this topic again and re-energize the debate and discussion about retention and what retention really requires in the education system. And I think this week, and my team will tell me if I've got this wrong, I think this week we have also launched a toolkit for schools on retention. And that toolkit is really digestible, it's short, it's pithy. It's not tempting to solve retention for a school, but it's intending to give you some places where you can begin. Some of the strategies that we know matter most when it comes to retention are set out in that toolkit, with some really specific examples of what you might be able to do, and some resources that we have written grounded in the evidence base, that you can use to support that work if you want to. So that's freely available on our website, and colleagues will share the link to that. And I would love to hear back from anyone who has a look at it and has thoughts on it, whether you think it's the best thing ever or you think it completely misses the point. I should be very interested to hear what you make of it. Now, that is all the stuff and waffle of the beginning of the webinar concluded. You'll be glad to know we can get into the detail of this, and start to think really practically about retention, which I'm not going to go through the statistics. Everyone who's on this call knows that we have an issue in education with retention. Lots of people leave. That's probably about as much as we need to say about it. But I want to hear from our panelists about, there are so many different aspects to this question of retention. And actually, I want to ask each of you, and Evelyn, I think I'm going to come to you first, but I'm going to ask each of you to pick a starting place. So not to say everything that needs to be done about retention, but what is the particular place you start at when you begin to think about this question? What's the first thing you would want to draw our attention to? And over the course of this next 50 minutes, we're going to walk around a variety of aspects of retention. But for each of the panelists, where do you begin? Where do you start on this question? Evelyn.
Thanks, Sinead. And I just want to say there's 72 people on this call, which is amazing. And I think that talks to the heart of why this webinar is so important. And the fact that, yes, it's cold and rainy, but people have turned up for it. So thank you for being here. My starting point, and as the conversation flows, I'd kind of like to get under the skin of some data, etc. But for me, there's something about school culture. There's something about making our staff, and regardless of where they are in the organisation, making staff really feel like they belong. So when we're looking at inclusion, where I like to focus it really on how people are made to feel. And that talks to the culture and the ethos of a school. So, belonging and mattering is probably two of my first starting points. And then my other one that I'd like us, I'm sure we'll unpack during our collective conversation, is around the conditions in schools in terms of flexibility. And we know that kind of post-pandemic, lots of organizations became more flexible in terms of how staff were able to work, been ahead, understand the kind of constraints of a timetable, etc. But I think there are some more subtle ways and things that we can do. And actually, I think that whole belonging, mattering does link to flexibility and how we kind of lean into that with a bit more kind of humanity. So those would be my starting points.
Lovely. Thanks, Evelyn. Sean, can I come to you and ask you, where do you start? Where do you jump on here?
I think for me, it comes down to that fundamental question that Sinead kind of touched on with asking for feedback on a recent piece of work is asking why twice to people. So asking the initial, why did you become a teacher? So I think we can lose sight of that. And I always say to people when I ask that question, this is not an interview. I am not expecting a whole, well, I always had a real passion for mathematics. I'm like, there must have been something that got you in the classroom. There must have been a moment when you thought, this is what I really, really, really want to do. And when we're talking about retention, speaking to colleagues, ideally before an exit interview, but speaking to people who are having a bit of a wobble or not sure if they want to do it and saying, well, why specifically don't you want to carry on? What has, and taking that pressure off them of saying, we don't need to apportion blame here. We don't need to say that you've done anything wrong or that the school's done anything wrong, but why don't you enjoy this anymore? Why aren't you willing to put in the hours here? Because I think when we look at the 12 drives of workplace well-being, with Six Nations at the forefront of my head, it's you can't take any player out of a team and say, we're just going to talk to you. It needs to be looking at all of them. So I think it's looking at that support, but also looking at the learning, looking at the belonging, and encouraging those of us who are more seasoned teachers to reflect on that as well and say, why did we do it? Why, as we said, it's a grim day today, it's horrible weather, and there's cheap holidays at the moment for non-teachers. So why do we keep doing it? Why do we still love the classroom? Why those of us that are being successfully retained, we need to also ask ourselves, like, why are we keeping in this job? Why? What is right about it? Why do we love it?
Why do we love it? I love that question. Thank you, Sean. Simon, where do you start on all of this? Retention, massive big issue.
I think it's the belief in that well-being is something that you protect rather than repair. So don't let yourself get to the position where organizationally people are unhappy being with you, because that's not great for them. But it's also quite demanding on an organization if you're spending lots of your institutional energy, scaffolding people to continue in a job that maybe they're not well aligned to. And I use that word alignment, intentionally because for us, securing an environment in which well-being is inherently part of the culture of the organisation is through the values that we seek in those we recruit. So we can teach the skills to teach. It's not that complicated to be an effective teacher. But finding people who believe in the mission, inherently believe in the mission, don't need to be persuaded in the mission. They walk through your door and they tell you, I want to work with children with complex learning disabilities because I believe in them. That's what we're looking for. And if you can find that alignment, then you can generally find ways of supporting them through the operational challenges because they have that inherent belief. But if you don't have that belief, then coming to work every day is going to be really uncomfortable.
Here we are, 2026, still can't unmute reliably. Dear goodness me. It's very interesting listening to all of you talking about the different places that you start, but what is so resonant in what you're talking about for me there is purpose and meaning. And it comes through so loudly. And we know the purpose and meaning is really central to the idea of workplace well-being. But for lots of us, it gets us out of bed in the morning and it drives us a long way. Um, and of course, we know that the education workforce has a higher level or a higher sense of purpose in its work than many other workforces do. So there's something really powerful in that. And hearing about the importance of getting the right fit at the outset, which I think for lots of people who in recent years have struggled with recruitment challenges, they've sort of maybe wanted to take any warm body with a pulse at times. And that's very understandable because there've been some real resource crunches. But I guess we're also about to head into a period where possibly there is much less resource crunch because of what's happening economically. It's going to be quite interesting. So Simon's point about values feels particularly opposite in the face of that. Um, I want to ask a question about, I want to ask you, each of you, a few different questions. I'm going to just signpost these. Um, So, Evelyn, I'm going to come back to you and ask about how important is inclusion and belonging, and why is it important? Why does it matter, and who does it matter for? Sean, I want to ask about what support, from your perspective, is there different kinds of support that different roles in a school setting appreciate or find more and less valuable? Do you notice that, or is everybody looking for the same kind of support? And Simon, I want you to reflect with us on what are some of the kind of almost stereotypical bad habits that leaders can have, often in their blind spots. But what do you think that if you had a magic wand, and, let me be clear, as a leader, I don't hold myself higher or better than anyone else, and I know you don't either. But as you look out over the sector and you could help leaders magic away some bad habits that we see repeatedly, which bad habits would you want to see addressed that you think are negatively impacting our ability to retain talent in the sector? So now you've each got your question. Let's go back. Evelyn, talk to us a bit about inclusion and belonging. And I'm asking you this because I know it matters deeply to you. But I also know that actually it matters deeply to us all, because the extent to which we get this right, I think, is as a very wide application. But talk to us about how you think about this.
Yeah, I think, well, your first question, how important is it? Well, it's super important. And if we think about the number of hours that we spend in a school, okay, the energy that we give, the passion that we give, and sometimes at the expense of our own families, right? We wake up every day, we're going into our schools and our trusts, and if you don't feel like you belong in that organization, then the many hours that you spend there can feel like a drain. It's that, can I get up in the morning and go into an organization where nobody makes me feel like I'm part of the organization? So because of how much we give, and I know that Sean, will talk about, the passion for why we go into teaching, etc. We show up every day because we want to be there. And so I think the culture, therefore, and this sense of inclusion and belonging has got to be at the forefront of leaders' minds, and it's kind of got to permeate our schools, our trusts, and our organisation. Why does it matter? Looking at some of the data, so obviously I did my reading before the webinar, but the working lives of teachers 2022-23 says that 74% of teachers spoke about the impact on their stress and well-being. 74% is super high. I will directly link that to the culture in a school, and your own research from talks about 50% of teachers, staff in schools say that the culture has a negative effect on their mental health. Okay. So with all of that in mind, and if we know the data, why aren't we, as leaders and people in positions of agency, not power, I talk about agency, why are we not doing something about it? And for me, there are some very, very quick wins. How do you make people feel like they belong in an organization? Number one, let's try and get everybody's name right. Okay. Let's acknowledge people in our schools. As head teachers and leaders, we often walk with our heads down because we're so busy. I talk about, let's look up and out. And when we're looking up and out, we're actually making sure that we're not missing anybody in the corridors. We're super diligent about how we do that with our children. We'd never bypass a child in a classroom or a corridor, but we're quite quick to, we're on a mission. I've kind of got to get to where I need to go. So that sense of belonging, if you don't even acknowledge me, And if my voice and my opinions, if I'm not asked, then actually, do I really feel like I belong in your school? And the second part around that is around this notion of mattering. And I unashamedly, but I quote him all the time, a guy called Mohammed Abdallah has done some great work on what mattering means. And I think it's about, do people notice when I'm not there? And when I return, when I return as a head teacher, I have been guilty of this. The first thing we say is, will you please do a return to work form? Hey, if I really matter in your organization and you're going to make me feel like I belong, maybe we could reframe that. I noticed you were absent. Lovely to have you back. We do need to sit down and fill out that form just so that I can be here to support you. I think it's some of those tiny, tiny actions and behaviors that will make people feel like they belong, that they matter, so that we can begin to flip some of this data, because 50% of school staff saying that the culture has a negative effect on their mental health and well-being. That's not okay. And that's driving retention. So it's really important. Why does it matter? Because of the impact it's having on our staff in schools. I hope that kind of covers
Lovely.
your question.
Yeah, I enjoyed that so much. The looking up and looking out, and the whole idea of mattering, and
Yeah.
the very small. It never ceases to amaze me, the very small moments of civility that matter enormously to people, that can just fall out of the dehumanizing sometimes that can happen in our environments. And as for names, I mean, I've been called Cyanide Mick Burley before now, so I think getting names right is quite important, even if they're complicated to say.
Yeah, exactly that.
Doesn't hurt. Sean, talk to us about different roles and what you notice just in your own practice and from your own experience, whether different roles in a school setting. Does everybody need the same support, or particular types of support helpful for different people? Because I'm guessing that, I know that we know from the data that support is a really important aspect of what helps people feel met and able to stay and be productive and successful in their jobs.
Yeah. Can I just say, no fun following something as impressive as that. I sort of always think of the poem by Irma Bombeck, I Loved You Enough, which is a parent talking to their child about, I loved you enough, and then going through all the stuff that those of us that had a good relationship with a parent when we're growing up were lucky enough to have a parent who made us clean our bedroom and eat our vegetables, and all the stuff at the time we really resented. I think for me, that's what support in a school needs to look like. I know that as professionals, we don't tend to talk about personal relationships, and we talk about keeping everything very professional. But for me, support needs to be that whole kind of thing of, I understand why I'm going through this process. And that needs to be at every stage. So even thinking of something like a return to work form, that's when support can stop feeling like support. And support can start feeling like that old chestnut we've all heard from the organisation, who should remain nameless. This is a supportive process. And it genuinely is. And we've really got to acknowledge that. We have to accept that everyone from the ECT to the head teacher to the chair of governors, we are all pulling in the same direction. We are all trying to be better versions of ourselves. There's a quote that I've stopped people in my faculty using because I personally find it problematic, of people saying, insanity is doing the same thing repeatedly and expecting different results. I find the term insanity there a bit problematic. But unpicking that with my faculty, I did say, I want you to make mistakes. And I want you to accept that I'm going to be there to help you pick up the pieces. And this is how we make progress. This is the thing that any of us, I'm sure we've all mentored PGCE students and ECTs. We encourage them to make mistakes, but do we actually model that behaviour? Do we encourage a colleague in our faculty, or even if we're senior leaders, do we encourage someone to come in and watch a lesson that we struggle with? Do we actually direct them to the things that we personally know we find difficult? And do we face up to those ourselves? So I think for me, support at every level really needs to be that modelling. And it needs to be having that support in place that needs to be, we are part of the same process. So if I'm speaking to my line manager, or I'm speaking to the head teacher, or I'm speaking to a member of the catering staff, we all within the school need to remember why we're doing it. We need to say this is a collective. This is, as Simon so eloquently put it, we're here, it's our purpose. We're here to help these children. So I think for me, the key takeaway, I hope I need to get better at, if I'm totally honest, I hope I'm going to continue improving, is having that open dialogue with people and is saying, actually, there are areas that I personally need to improve. And that's fine. Actually, that's a good thing. There is no point in staying in teaching if you think, well, I've cracked this is easy. And I don't think there's any senior leaders who are going to say like, oh, I 100% know what I'm doing all of the time. I never get flustered. So it's having that transparency and that openness and also just that compassion for each other and saying, we are both people. If you are struggling, I am here to speak to. And if I'm not the right person, that's fine. I can direct you to support. So I think that would be kind of my take on it. I don't know if Sinead, that's something that you would agree with.
I love that, Sean. I think the humanity, the role modeling, what's challenging, what's difficult. Actually, I think we might come back to another conversation if we have time in the panel about rupture and repair, which I think is really important. I mean, you said that you were still learning, you know, from my grey-haired seat, there are days when I feel like a novice. And I wish they were less frequent than they are, but it just, you know, if you care, then you keep learning and you follow your curiosity and do the best you can. And that probably is some really good role modeling. Not always in the moment, a bit like your vegetable analogy. People won't thank you necessarily right then and there, but they do know ultimately where it's going to take them. So yeah, I really enjoyed that. Thank you, Sean. And just to colleagues, I can see that there's a little bit of chat and some insight coming through, which is always good. But if you're sitting watching and thinking, I wish she'd asked this question, which is way better than what she's asking them, put it in the chat, because I promise you then I will ask them and you'll find out what they think. Simon, I gave you the very jolly opportunity to reflect on leadership practice and some of the things that might be more common than you think they need to be. And if we could knock on the head, would make a substantive difference. Where does that take you?
Yeah, I think before I talk about this, I think I probably need to caveat it with the fact that I'm blessed to work in a school that has been performing at a really high level for a really long time. So it creates a culture of leadership that doesn't always exist in other contexts. And, you know, we need to recognize that leadership is sometimes a pragmatic response to context. So what I wouldn't want is people listening to this going, oh, well, it's all right for you to say that, because actually for me, that isn't going to work. So, you know, there's just in the spirit of honesty, I work in a school with amazing people who've been here a very, very long time, and therefore we can work on the basis that certain things are accepted that might need to be built in other places. But for me, I suppose, you know, that the bad habits that I kind of try really hard to keep an eye on is not over managing and under leading. And by that, I mean getting in the way, being a bit controlling, over prescribing, over specifying, so that people start to lose faith in their decision making processes, and build that sense of anxiety around validation. People don't need to be validated by me. They need to be validated by their own reflections on their own qualities and the impact they're having on the children on a day-to-day basis. And I kind of go back to the point that was being made about agency. I think agency is really important within the context of leadership. And I think agency needs to be conceptualized as very distinct to autonomy. So we don't give autonomy here because there are really clear frameworks of expectations and really clear processes that people need to adhere to and policies that they need to stick to, and they're there for good reason. But within that, there's an awful lot of intellectual and operational freedom, because the staff know the kids better than I do. They're the ones that work with them day in, day out. So let them be the decision makers and lead them into a space where they feel confident and bold in their decision making, in the knowledge, coming back to what Sean was saying, that is if they get it wrong, and we all do, they won't be judged, they'll be supported. So there's a culture of honesty and transparency that says, I'm really struggling with this. Because I don't want people coming to work and quietly feeling really, really sad that they're doing a bad job. I want them coming to people, well, not me generally, because I don't know anything about classroom practice really anymore, but going to their subject leads and saying, look, how can you help me do this better? And I think one of the joys about working in the specialist sector is it's intellectually rich. We're not constrained by chronological structures that tell us we have to teach things at a certain point or achieve certain outcomes by a certain age. Our job is to understand what children know already and know what to teach them next. And so, that sense of these are the supportive structures that enable that to happen, and I'm going to be led into a space where I can do that myself is really important. And the other one that I think is absolutely key, and I do genuinely believe that this is a real challenge around retention, is the risks around activity without purpose. We want to draw really tight causal links between the time that people spend working and the impact it has on children. We do not want them spending huge amounts of time doing things that have no correlative relationship with pupil outcomes. It's not always a causative relationship, but we at least want a correlative one, and then we can explore whether or not it's causative as well. And that requires me and my joint head colleague Heidi and the rest of the SLT to sometimes be quite brave and stand up for the community of the school and just say, we're not doing that. That's bonkers. Why are you asking me to do that? Why are you asking the team to do that? We're not going to. And I think that's also important from the point of view of leadership, not management, is that leaders will sometimes just hold the line and say, no, not going to do it. And that's really tough when you're having to stand up to people that are in positions of greater authority than you are. We're a maintained school, we still work for a local authority. So sometimes they will ask us to do things that have not been as well thought through as perhaps you might like. And we have to explain to them why we're not going to do it. And that's to protect the time, because I want people coming to school, enthused about what they're about to do in the day. And not all the days are easy, but at least when they've been difficult, if you know that you've had an impact, if you know that you've done good within that time, it makes it easier to come back in the next day.
Really powerful, Simon. You do that thing, don't you? You just say some small, a few pithy sentences, and then I'm like thinking, that's really deep, man. I love what you said about underleading, because we all understand over management and getting in the way, but when it goes alongside underleading, that's really powerfully juxtaposed. And I think this whole point about activity without purpose. I mean, I have a view that we spend a lot of time being distracted by stuff that's noise and stuff and nonsense. And it's not that anyone particularly wants to do it, but somehow it's created within the system. Holding that line of not complying with requests that you deem to be not sufficiently correlated with the outcomes you're trying to achieve is, I think, super important when we get to retention, but also caught in a dynamic, because when we lose leaders with experience, I think it's harder for younger leaders or leaders earlier in their leadership career to sometimes have the confidence to hold that line. So I think it's really important that you highlight that and have the confidence to say, we can make that call because we look at it, we review it, we assess the level of impact, and then we'll make a shout if it's the right or the wrong thing. I think the more that we can talk about that in the sector, the more we can sort of offer people the opportunity for more agency in their leadership and across the school system. So loving that. I wanted to come and ask you each a little bit more on some of the themes that come through the work that we've done on retention that may or may not resonate with you. And Simon, I'm going to come to you and ask you about trust. And specifically, so I'm going to go around, I'll share all these questions and then I'll come back, Simon, to you to start. But thinking about trust, and I know you've just described your environment, which sounds like a really nice, supportive, established team to be part of. But if you were thinking about building trust, if you inherited another setting and it was a very low trust environment, based on what you've learned from what you do, how would you go about trying to build trust from a low base? What would be the most important bits of that for you to consider? And then, Evelyn, I wanted you to pick up and see if there's more to say on flexibility, because you mentioned it a little bit earlier. And you know, you've been in the seat of being a head teacher, trying to accommodate, I would imagine, varying requests from people. But what's the point? How much flexibility in reality can schools meaningfully offer flexibility enough to make a difference? I'm really curious what you think about that. And Sean, I wondered if you would talk to us a little bit about, in different roles, again, thinking with your leadership, middle leadership, classroom, different lenses on this, but how can we think about work-life balance and kind of protecting our own energy individually, with actually getting enough done, getting enough of the stuff done? Because there is, it seems, in education, a never-ending list of things to be done. So how do we get that balance between accomplishing enough, but also protecting our own time and having the opportunity to have an actual life from time to time? I'd be really interested to hear what you think about that. Simon, this point about trust. If you were starting from a really low base, how would you be thinking about establishing trust?
And there's a challenge sometimes about whether you coach your way out of a situation or whether you mentor your way out of a situation. And I think sometimes we get overly focused on the importance of coaching, but sometimes things just need to be mentored in the first instance, because you either don't have sufficient referential material to draw upon in order to have a shared coach conversation, or things just need to be decided. And I suppose, in that sense of establishing a shared understanding, I think that in the beginning point that there needs to be an articulation of the mission. Now, depending on the context, you might not be able to co-construct that mission because that mission might be co-constructed for you by an organization that is in crisis, an organization that's riven with dysfunction. But that needs to be articulated as a stepping stone towards the building of a shared experience, a shared, set of values, a shared set of, kind of agreed opportunities. And then you need to stay the course. You need to hold to the mission, but you also need to be able to bring people along with you. And so you need to shape their understanding of you as a person. And there are two things that I think have helped me do that, because I've been at this school a very, very long time, but there was a day when it was my first day as joint head. So the whole context had changed. People's relationships with me had changed. All of a sudden, I'm the person that's accountable for all of this. I wasn't before. And so to some extent, I've experienced this, but obviously in a very different context. So it's an experience of it in a thriving, successful organization. But two things that stood out for me is that I think trust is built on shared vulnerability, the acceptance that I'm finding this hard, just like you're finding this hard, and we need to find a way through this together. So if I'm not doing things well, it's okay for you to come and talk to me about that, and I will listen to you. Might not agree. I might be able to explain why I'm doing this way, and we might have to come to a conclusion of shared disagreement, but it will be done respectfully, and it will be done thoughtfully, and it will be revisited when we need to revisit it, because I might be right in the moment and wrong in the long term. So there are things like that that need to be explored. And I think the other one that's really key is to have the courage to make hard decisions in the moment and not duck them. I think the moment that people see you look difficulty in the eye and turn away is the moment with which trust will be eroded and faith will be lost. And those can sometimes be quite small moments. So to give you an example, one that happened very, very early on in my headship career was a young person who'd had a very difficult couple of days, had experienced a fixed term exclusion and was having his return to school meeting, and made it very, very clear in the meeting that he was not ready to return to school. And it was a hard meeting. The easiest thing in the world would have been to have gone, okay, welcome back, let's crack on. But he just wasn't emotionally ready. And his parents were looking at me, and the teacher was looking at me, and I just went, okay, I don't think this is going to work today. Let's try again tomorrow. And then had to go through the process of reissuing, all of the kind of the statutory paperwork and re-reporting it all to the local authority. But the teacher looked at me with a look of like, wow, okay. So where the difficult decision had to be made, you made it, and you made it for the right reasons, but, and you made it because it was right for the community, not right for you. And it's so little things like that can be really, really quite important. And then there are bigger things. And these are the things why we're paid a reasonable salary. Now, I'm currently running £100,000 in-year deficit. That's not a comfortable place to be. and I'm refusing to pay it down because I can evidence that we're structurally underfunded within the context of the special school system. So I am not reducing staffing. I am not reducing expenditure. I am arguing quite vociferously that we need to be provided with a better funding settlement. That's quite tiring. It's quite hard work. But what it means is that people recognise that you've got their back, that you're not going to place them in a situation where they're coming into an organisation that is unsafe or ineffective, that you're going to hold those lines. And then when you have to go to them and tell them, I'm really sorry, you can't buy that, we can't afford that, they understand and trust that the decision is made in good faith because they know that you're holding the line on the big stuff, and therefore when you have to say no on the smaller things, they understand the context in which that is happening. I don't want to give the impression it's easy. It's really not. And in the spirit of sort of shared vulnerabilities, and Sinead's heard me say this before, I put that I access supervision in the school diary. So the staff know that the joint head teacher needs support to be able to do the job that is incredibly difficult to do. And it hopefully empowers them to ask the same question about whether they can access supervision or whether they can access supportive structures within our organisation that might not be formally, kind of delivered in that way. Those things are really important. We're not superheroes. We try to do a good job on more days than we do bad ones, but we do need help to do that.
Really, there's so much in that. And I think the shared vulnerability and the straightforwardness of talking about the issues as they are and your experience of them, there is something that I think in the honesty of sharing that is really important rather than trying to present an image or project an image that I think it makes sense that should support greater trust in a team. And I do think that, the being able to say that I'm accessing support and that's important and it enables me to do the job or supports me to do the job is hugely important. Not least actually because there is so much, I think, in our general culture right now, which, whether it intends to or not, has an expectation of things being, really correct straight away, as they should be first time, and quite little tolerance for when things go wrong. We hearing that back more and more from schools. So there's also something in your shared vulnerability that I think allows for things to not be okay, for that to be discussed, and then for people to come back and try and make it better. And that is definitely a lot harder than it sounds, but coming at it from where you're coming with those values so clear feels like a really strong place to start with trust. So really appreciated hearing that. Evelyn, people are working from home. There are people who get to do their laundry at lunchtime, like living the dream, Can schools offer meaningful flexibility?
Yeah, I'm definitely going to answer that from my perspective, but I just kind of want to loop back. Don't we want to go and work in Simon's school, right? Just kind of those kind of shared values, and but I'm hearing the journey's not always easy. And I just want to say something about trust because I couldn't agree more with what Simon has said. And there's that kind of age-old saying that trust is, it's hard won and quickly lost. And I think what our staff and schools need as well in terms of trust is that consistency. I always used to say to my team, how we show up every day. Of course, we have vulnerabilities and stuff might have happened at home, but what staff need to hear is that kind of consistency. So how we're going to, obviously you think about equity, etc., but consistency I also think is really important when we're talking about trust, because you can lose it on the spin of a coin if we're not consistent. But anyway, that wasn't your question. Your question was around flexibility. And look, I don't think it's, I was head of a large secondary, and we had a lot of requests for flexi working. And just to say, not just from women who may have come back from maternity leave, etc. I think, and I also think we need to be cognizant of that when people are asking for flexi working, it could be for a whole gamut of reasons, whether it is, I just kind of want to work 4 days, when my child's in nursery, two, I just want to be able to spend some time with my aging parents. And I think that comes back to that kind of human leadership as well. We all have policies, but they're a piece of paper, right? I think it's what sits behind the policy and how we respond to those requests. So, yes, everything changed post-COVID, people working from home, etc., etc. The reality is that you do need so many teachers in front of a young person, so many associate staff in a building at one time. That is a given, okay? I think, though, that we can be more considerate. And for me, I think where staff go back to the trust, where they feel trusted, where they feel listened to, is that if they do put in a request for flexi working, it's how that conversation then pans out. Is it fill in a form, I'll do the numbers, computer says no? That's not going to make me feel like I belong in your school. It's not going to be good for my well-being. It's not going to be good for me. So I think there is something around, how we engage with the process. And I think where we can, we should, because it's definitely a retention tool. Maternity Paternity Project did a significant piece of research. Women between the ages of 30 and 39 are the largest group leaving the profession. When I say this to, people that I'm working with, CEOs and head teachers, they often respond with, really? I didn't know that. So I think we do need to keep on top of the data and be cognizant of what the landscape looks like, and then try as hard as we can. And if we can't, I think what staff want to hear is the why. And it's not a no forever. And it might be, due to the pressures of the timetable and the number of staff, we can't do it this time, but we definitely consider it for next time. And I think there's also the nuance between I want to work 3 days, 4 days a week, to my elderly parent needs to go to the hospital every Thursday at 2 o'clock for 6 weeks. Please, could I have that lesson covered so that I can go? Who wouldn't do that? Okay, that's humanity. That's your caring. That's your being flexible. So I think we need to kind of just think a bit more broadly about what flexibility looks like. And then my only other thing to add very quickly, conscious of time, is that I think the system needs to be a little bit more fluid in terms of offering people career breaks. I think it's a system level. I think, in the system, we work, then you get to retirement, then you're out, okay? Or you work, this is too much, I'm out of here. Why can't we have those conversations around, and this talks to professional development, somebody might want to go off and do an MA, somebody might want to go and climb a mountain. Let's see what we can do so that we then get them back. And I just think we need to be a bit more flexible in our attitudes towards flexi working.
Thank you, Evelyn. It's interesting, isn't it, that we hear these same themes coming through, that there's a lot about humanity and engaging with people and operating from coherent values. There's a lot of commonality across the responses to this, but really helpful and powerful to hear that. Sean, let me come to you on this question of work-life balance. Like, is it possible to have some kind of work-life balance and get all the stuff done?
Trying to point out, I love that the other panelists smiled when that question was asked. I think that's 99%. I'll be interested to hear what you hear, and 1%. I'm kind of glad I'm not answering.
Go, Sean!
Well, I'll try my best. At the risk of sounding horribly hyperbolic, I kind of think of that old maxim of the path to hell is, or the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I think the same is true for teacher burnout and people quitting the profession. I don't think lazy people quit teaching, if I'm brutally honest. For those of us of a certain vintage, we can probably remember when leaving school before 5:30 would get that look that's kind of similar to when they pull the curtain across first class and are looking at us in economy, have been like, could have done better. Because I find it's like, I've got no issue with someone who leaves early, and I don't need to know why. It's not my business. If you have to leave early because, like Evelyn said, you've got an elderly parent or you've got caring responsibilities, that's fine. We need to work around that. I would say the key thing, kind of similar to what Simon said, and that's why we need this accountability and really solid leadership, like Simon obviously has, is having that mentoring in place as well. I honestly think I never in my life has worked as hard as I did in the first 3 years of teaching, when I was constantly on the cusp of being put on a support plan. Because I genuinely thought I was doing a really, really, really good job because I wasn't asking anyone for feedback. So my displays were changed almost weekly. And I was marking books 2 miles, one even better if on every single page after close marking, which meant I could probably do maybe a set a week properly. So rather than everyone getting high quality marking, I was burning myself out because I was a very, very, very busy fool. And I think that's so common in the early stages of teaching. And I honestly think that's where we lose people. There's that whole idea we lose people in the first 5 years. I think part of it, we need to sit down with our early career staff and say, realistically, you can be here till midnight and you won't be done. There will always be something more. There will always be something that you think I could have done better. And it's learning to let go of that. And I think the higher up I couldn't speak to senior leadership, that's where I'd speak to these esteemed colleagues in the chat. But I think there's an element, even in middle leadership, you learn to let stuff go and we learn what needs to be done and what is fundamental. And I'd say to all my colleagues, I always say, would this be good enough for my child? So as somebody who doesn't have children myself, I put myself in that perspective of thinking, okay, I could read all of the displays in the SMSC corridor this week, or that can come when I've got some year 11 gain time. And actually, for the here and now, I'm going to ring 3 parents this week. And that's the real priority. So I think at every level of leadership, we need to have that discussion with our colleagues, but also with the people who we line manage, of saying, I'm not checking up on you. This is purely a kind of mentoring conversation. Can you talk me through what your week looks like? And it's having that openness and being straight with people. Like, similar to Simon, I'll quite happily tell people, like, I wanted to quit this job when I first started because it was so hard and I was working so hard and seeing nothing back. And actually it took someone mentoring me and saying, love your enthusiasm, which is always a setup for I'm about to tell you what you're doing wrong, but we need to hear it and we need to have those discussions. And when we're talking work-life balance, I think one of the awkward conversations I'm sure we've all had to say with people is actually the deadline is not negotiable. But if it's a reasonable deadline, that shouldn't be a source of anxiety for them or stress for us. If Simon asks me to mark a set of assessments by tomorrow morning, well, that's not fair. If he's given me 2 weeks and he's checked in on me, I'm more than happy to take that. So I think a big chunk of it is, much as it sounds like it's my only point this evening, it's having that open dialogue. It's being respectful of each other, and it's asking people to bring us a problem. And I found 99% of the time, you don't want a solution, you just want to be listened to. Like, you just want to tell me that this is tough. And if I can help, I can. Or actually, sometimes you just need me to say, yeah, that's rubbish, isn't it? But what can we do?
Absolutely. Not to underestimate the power of validation, that it's rubbish, isn't it? I mean, and also, I feel like you made several points there, Sean. I'm just going to, I think there's definitely more than one. Even though I got distracted with wanting to give an appropriately boundaried hug to young Sean when he was running around doing 75 displays a week. I think what I heard in that really clearly was, as a beginner teacher, learning boundaries and learning to prioritize is actually a hugely important part of this. And I think those that can learn that earlier on seem like they might have more likelihood of being able to stay in the profession and being able to make it work in their own like work life, wider life
Yeah.
work.
I think, sorry, one of the whole key things that I think, if I had leadership like I've seen here today, we need to remind people it's okay to say no.
Yep. Yep. Really important.
We're not going to resent you. It's not going to lead to a support plan. It's, if I ask you to do something you genuinely can't, fair enough. Thank you for letting me know.
Yeah. And that support, we started at support, didn't we? And here we come back again. Look, I'm failing on timekeeping here. Les, I'm sorry I didn't get to talk about climate change, but you'll have to forgive me for that, and we'll maybe come back to the issue of young people's needs in another webinar. Panelists, I'm going to ask you for your last reflection on all of this conversation. As far as practical things to do on teacher retention, what's the most important that you sit with as you think now on the back of this conversation? And I'm just going to say to participants, if you enjoyed the webinar, tell us what else you might like to be involved in, or give us some feedback on it. We're always looking to hear what it is that colleagues think we should be doing. So I think Amy's sharing a short, like super quick survey. If you can fill that out, that'd be super. Sean, let me come to you first. What's your last pithy sentence you're leaving us with as a thought at the end of all of this? And then I'll come to Simon and then Evelyn.
As a teacher, you would never leave a child who you knew was in need. So you'd never do that to a colleague either.
Yeah. Love that. Thank you. Simon.
I know it's a bit of a cliche, but it's the whole thing of never ask somebody to do something you're not prepared to do yourself, says the head teacher who spent 2.5 hours in Lidl car park on Friday trying to persuade a young person that Lidl really wasn't the place to be. The joys of community-based education.
I love that. That's walking the talk, man. Love that. Evelyn.
I love that. I think for me, it's about that kind of human-centric leadership. Every day, every day, every day would be my final point.
Thank you all so much. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing. I think there's been lots of really rich, thoughtful contribution there today. And thank you to all of the folks who've joined the call. Thanks for turning up on a rainy, what day of the week is this? Tuesday? I'm lost. Some day of the week. That you've bothered to come from all around the country. Really nice to see you all here. I'm going to wish everybody well, and at 1 minute to 5, I'm going to liberate you to go back to the rest of your lives. Panelists, thank you again. You really have been fantastic and thoughtful and generous in what you've shared. And to education support colleagues, thank you for keeping the show on the road and getting the show on the road and having a show. Good luck, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thanks, Sinead. Thanks, everyone. Bye.